Hi again, welcome to clip 5. This one's going to be a short one, I promise. But it's really to supplement the summary that I've tried to give of materialist approaches in anthropology for this week's lecture by a clip devoted specifically to what's come to be known as practice theory, and particularly the work of the French sociologist and in some ways anthropologist. I mean, he defined himself as a sociologist, but did ethnographic fieldwork in North Africa, and in many ways his arguments were deeply anthropological. Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu is an immensely significant figure in the development of social theory in France, and his influence became global in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. An extremely sophisticated thinker, and also, by all accounts, a lovely human being, and a major influence in kind of Marxist and post-Marxist approaches in social theory and also in anthropology, as we'll see. So I mentioned this idea of Bourdieu being a nice man. I think it's really important to highlight the way that he kind of enacted this Marxist principle that theory is not just for interpreting the world, but also for changing it. I put up this quote from Bourdieu's own writing. I often say sociology is a martial art, a means of self-defense. So Bourdieu came from a working class background and saw his theoretical output, his studies of practice, of French society, of Algerian society, where he did a lot of his early fieldwork, as ways through which to promote an activist theorization that doesn't just interpret the world, but seeks to create the conditions for also changing it. I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Pierre Bourdieu is famous for a whole bunch of stuff. You may know or have come across the expression social capital, cultural capital. Notice the Marxist terminology, capital, right? So capital is not just material, it's also social, it's also cultural. And some people have more access to social and cultural capital through their education, through their positioning in society, through the activities that they pursue than others. So forms of inequality are not just economic, they're social and cultural in that sense. And people can, I guess another word for it would be privilege, right? When we talk about, for example, white privilege in debates about anti-racism. This is a kind of a concept that is continuous with Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital. Some people have more possibilities available to them than others, right? That's a very Bourdieusian idea. But the idea that I want to focus on today is Bourdieu's idea of habitus, which he inherits from Marcel Mauss. And the basic idea here is that it's really an answer to the question that stems from Marxist materialist anthropology of how ideological formations get reproduced. How do they exist in time? How does one get inculcated into a particular ideological formation? And if you remember, for Marx, the distinction was between base and superstructure. So base was the material stuff, the economic relations of the means and relations of production, the modes of production, and the superstructure were formations of law, political formation, culture, and so on. And all of this realm of superstructure was the ideological legitimation of the underlying economic material relations of the base, right? So there's a kind of dualism in Marxism between the more material stuff and the more ideal stuff, if you like, right? The material embodied stuff comes under economic formations and infrastructure, and things like law, culture, politics, and so on comes on the side of the mental, the superstructure that corresponds more to the mind than to the body. And Bourdieu's notion of the habitus, which draws actually on Marcel Mauss's essay on techniques of the body, where Marcel Mauss attended to the ways in which various cultural phenomena reproduce themselves through the ways that people use their body. So for example, the way that a French soldier might hold their gun might be different through the way that they're disciplined to the way that an English or a German soldier might hold their gun, or the style of swimming might be different. Those are ways in which through culture and society reproduce themselves for Marcel Mauss. Bourdieu takes that idea and really uses it as a solution to the question of ideological reproduction. Basically says that ideological structures get reproduced through embodied structures. Now, I've put this very long and absolutely awful quote from Bourdieu's book, from the reading that you have to read this week, The Logic of Practice, just as an illustration of what really truly atrocious writing can look like. Now, I don't speak good enough French to read Bourdieu in the original in French, so I don't know if the French was quite as bad as its English translation. But let me tell you that this definition of habitus that I put on the slide, which is so bad that I won't even read it out, is an example of the kind of writing that you should avoid in your essays, if I may say so. It doesn't make you sound smart to use so many abstract words and such a complex syntax in a single sentence where the reader is completely baffled as to what your meaning might be, right? So I won't even read out this quote, but I'll just give you an example of habitus, a very famous example, which I'm sure you'll come across in other courses in your anthropology degree, which is based on Bourdieu's Algerian fieldwork with Kabyle Berbers in Algeria, where he looks, again, my kind of this little square of my talking interferes with a diagram behind it, which is a diagram of a Kabyle house. And they're really very much influenced by Lévi-Strauss, about whom we'll talk next week. He sees the space of a Berber house as basically enacting the basic ideological distinctions in Kabyle society between male and female, high and low, dry and humid, light and dark. Each of these structural distinctions, which are ideological distinctions, are embedded and embodied through the distribution of artifacts and of bodies in the space of the interior of a Kabyle house, right? So he does this extremely sensitive ethnographic account of how different parts of the room are associated with a male, which are also associated with a higher, also associated with light, and different parts of the room associated with females, with lower, with darkness, and shows how this embodied distribution of the space of the room and of the house basically inculcates ideological distinctions, for example, between the hierarchy of the genders, male high, female low, in an embodied way, so that as Kabyle people go about their daily lives inhabiting this space, they're effectively inhabiting their own ideology, right? They're inhabiting the fundamental structural oppositions through which differential distinctions between, for example, men and women are enacted, right? So that's an example of habitus, right? This structuring structure which is embodied and through which ideology gets reproduced through time. You're effectively born into it. So that's an example of how habitus operates. It's really good at explaining ideological transmission, if you like. One of the main criticisms that's been made of it is that it's not so good at explaining transformation, because if ideology is so deeply embedded in us, because it's transmitted through not our ideas that can be disputed and contested, but through the way that we discipline our very bodies and how they move into space, then how can ideology be contested? How can ideology be transformed over time? Becomes a real problem for a practice theoretical approach such as Bourdieu's. So that's one of the criticisms that's been leveled against Bourdieu. Okay, there goes my very brief flavor of Pierre Bourdieu's thinking. A bit as with Marx, I can't possibly do justice to the complexity of these arguments in these short clips, but I hope this has given you a flavor. And I'll now see you in the next clip, where we'll, as usual, look at some criticisms, and then we'll have a final kind of extra little clip where I'll talk about some other forms of focus on materiality by anthropologists that are not materialist in this hard sense of Marxism that we've been looking at so far. So see you in the next clip.